Okay. So Frank will probably be in shortly. So I'm Ruth, but I guess you kind of know that. To my left is Dick Murgatroyd. Microphone. There you
go. Anyway, Dick Murgatroyd, member of the School Foundation Board.
And then there's Andy.
Hi, Andy Kusher, board member.
And Frank.
Oh, hello.
Oh, go ahead, Jordan.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Jordan Clee, Kusher, program officer.
And then Frank, I'm sure he'll be here shortly. So why don't you all introduce yourselves real quickly?
I'll start. I'm Tracy Wells. I'm the VP of Development. I know Ruth, Dick. We met years ago when I worked at Redwood in Northern Kentucky.
Oh, I thought you looked familiar when I saw you. I wasn't sure if that was you or not.
Years ago.
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
I'm Debbie Brooks. I'm Executive Vice President here at Ywca, and I've been in a meeting with some of you previously, I think with Ywca and with a board I'm on with Transitions Incorporated.
Okay.
And I'm Sarah. I am a development officer. I work primarily with foundations and corporations, and I've been with the Y for a little over 4 years now. And Ruth and Jordan and I met a couple years ago.
And you're very patient.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you could, I know we've funded this program before. So is there anything different about the program, or what progress have you made in the program since we last were there?
So I can talk about a couple different things. I think last time when the program was funded, we were really starting to dive very deep into our trauma-informed care journey of becoming a completely trauma-informed care agency. And we've really focused a lot on that with our survivors and families in shelter. So all of our staff, regardless of position, are required to be trained in trauma-informed care. Our shelter staff are required to take a 3-day training, along with a bunch of other trainings that we've implemented as well, domestic violence essentials. There's a whole slew of trainings. We've also, in 2019, we started a partnership with Greater Cincinnati Behavioral Health, and we now have a on-site therapist that we work with as well. During COVID, the meetings have been virtual, but it is a therapist that specifically works with us and our clients. We also went through a transition with our workforce development services, where we fully integrated them into our residential services. So the workforce services and workforce readiness services would be more accessible to our survivors in shelter, and that's been going incredibly well. And as of this current moment, 2020 was definitely a whirlwind for us with our residential services. So kind of overnight, we had to make the decision to move all of our survivors and children from our communal shelters to hotel rooms. And that was about 80 individuals moving from our shelters to hotel rooms. At the time, we had to move into about 4 or 5 different hotels across the greater Cincinnati region. We ended up having to hire 24-hour security for all of those hotels, completely changed the way that we were doing our food production and delivery by tablets, iPads, so we could be more accessible to survivors, as well as so survivors could participate in telehealth appointments. We networked with Project Connect, which is a organization or an initiative in Hamilton County. So children who were doing remote learning had access. So we worked with Project Connect, and we had a teacher on site at our hotel Monday through Friday, all day long, to work with our children that were staying in shelter to make sure that they were staying up to date and everything on their remote schooling and had all the resources they needed. And right now we are in the process of hopefully in August transitioning back to our communal shelters. So that's something that's being worked through in this moment. But I would say those are the major ones that I think of when I think of the changes that we've gone through with our shelter services over the years.
Oh,
I don't know if Debbie, if you wanted to add anything.
No, you hit on the big ones. It's obviously been a really challenging year for our clients and for our staff with the shelters, but I think we've done a really good job of keeping the infection rate extremely low, surprisingly low. But I think without having moved into the hotels, it would have been a much different story we'd be telling. It was expensive, but it was the right thing to do. And moving back into the shelters that we have now, we're going to have slightly reduced census so that there's more spacing. So we're not sure yet, depending on what the need is, we may hang on to a few hotel rooms for overflow. And then we're in the process of looking for other kind of buildings that we could move our shelters into that in the long term will be accommodating more around a single room occupancy for families and individuals.
Looking at domestic violence from a collaborative type of approach, as you know, we are around town with a lot of different agencies. And if you could just walk us through a call comes from a person that is the victim of domestic abuse. The call goes to the police, correct? And then what happens from there? What agencies are involved?
So calls may go to the police. A lot of times families are fleeing domestic violence and they're not going through the police. They may have had prior experience that didn't end well, that the abuser didn't get charged, they didn't stay in jail. So sometimes sometimes there's a domestic violence case that the police are called to. And in those instances, in some communities, not all, Women Helping Women has a program where they can come out on site and meet with the survivor and or the victim and the police to help coordinate right at that moment. If that individual needs shelter, then they will refer them to us, usually depending on what the need is for the client. If it's a need for emergency shelter, then they will refer them to us. They will contact our hotline, and then we'll go through the process of intake with that individual. Sometimes people don't go through the police, as I said. Maybe it hasn't risen to that level, but they know they need to get out because they're being controlled in a whole lot of different ways. And they will reach out to us via our hotline. And at that time, we'll help them assess what the safety is for them. And do they want shelter? Do they need other community-based services instead? Sometimes we can move them directly into our housing program and they don't even need to come through shelter. That's a relatively new thing in the last probably 4 years that HUD has funded direct access to housing. So that's been a great option for folks who don't need shelter. So a lot of different things can happen. We have a family justice center at YWCA, which is kind of a one-stop shop for folks that are experiencing domestic violence, and they can connect with and it's not shelter-based, it's in the community, so they can connect through that. And that may come to us from the prosecutor's office, may have a case and they identify there's a need for a lot of different wraparound services, or they may come to us directly, and then we'll connect them with legal aid, law enforcement. Women Helping Women is also participating in our Family Justice Center. So we all collaborate through that entity. So there's a lot of different entry points, and all of the organizations that are working with survivors are collaborating and meeting on a regular basis to make sure that we're not that people are getting their needs met and services aren't duplicated. But unfortunately, there's more domestic violence than there's even the ability probably to serve. So there's plenty to go around, and we all kind of have our niche that we do and work together that way.
Are there other shelters or other organizations that provide shelter or other housing for victims in the city?
So no, not domestic violence shelter per se. There is some very small housing programs that provide some housing for domestic violence survivors, but they're not. We have about 130 units of housing. These I'm talking about maybe, and they may be specialized. There's one that's focuses on Spanish speaking individuals, and I think they have, I don't know, maybe four apartments. So they're smaller like that for housing. But as far as domestic violence emergency shelter, we are the only program in Hamilton County, and we have the only shelter in Claremont County that serves Adams and Brown as well.
So Lydia's House and Bethany House and things like that are not for victims of domestic abuse?
No, so we work in partnership with Bethany House, Inner Hospitality Network, Salvation Army. We're all considered family shelters. So we serve families, and we actually meet monthly, and we actually meet more than that. We're in groups together all the time, but because we have some funding that comes through just for the family shelters, and we're very coordinated in those services. But those, if they have a domestic violence case, an active domestic violence case, they refer them to us. But usually they'll come directly to us first. If a call goes through the CAP line, which is the coordinated access point for all of the shelters, and domestic violence is identified, they get directed to us. So we are the, and you mentioned Lydia's House. Lydia's House is more of it's kind of a hybrid. It's not funded through the continuum of care, and it's not technically emergency shelter. It's more of a little longer term housing. And certainly some of the folks that they have probably have histories of domestic violence, but they haven't come, it's not necessarily, that emergency shelter piece of it. So Lydia's House, they actually, coordinate loosely with all the other shelters as well as housing programs. And we're in meetings with them as well.
Okay.
Can I just follow up real quick on something you said? Because I was confused.
Okay.
When I read the application, I had read that like your average length of stay was about 56 days and you had room for, I think, 81 clients you could hold. But then you just mentioned something about you have 130.
That's
what's the difference?
Shelter is what you just said. That's emergency shelter, and people can stay in it. Usually, some people may be in it less than 30 days, some are more. So the average right now, and it changes, is probably around 56 because we've got some barriers in the community around employment because of COVID. We have a shortage of affordable housing in our community. So sometimes people have to stay in emergency shelter a little longer in order to get some housing. But the 130 units I talked about, that's housing. So the people come into that, and usually they would stay in that housing between 6 months and 18 months and even a little bit longer, a couple of years. So yeah, what we try to do is as soon as somebody comes into emergency shelter is start planning with them as to what their next step is. Usually they're interested in getting some housing away from the abuser. And so we begin planning with them around what that's going to look like for them. And a lot of times they need that help in housing, and we have HUD funding that helps supplement the cost of that housing, for up to 2 years if needed.
So if someone is experiencing domestic violence, but they're not impoverished, they have money, but they just don't have the ability to find a place to go that's going to be secluded enough, do you help those folks also?
Yeah, certainly. Anyone can come in. There's no income barrier. But probably with somebody like that, they may be able to get into housing faster because they have the ability, you know, we can help them identify housing, find housing, help them safety plan around the abuse. So, because unfortunately, you know, domestic violence doesn't discriminate with regards to socioeconomic status, and those the person who's doing the abuse may continue to attempt to control and potentially hurt the person. So they're getting probably a lot more support around that area, but also will help them with whatever they need. Sometimes we'll get those calls and they'll say kind of what you said is, I have a job, I've got money, I got to get away from this guy today, you know, or immediately. Or I can stay with my family a couple weeks, but this isn't ideal and I need, you know, to get away from him and get into some housing. We can help them connect directly into housing so that they don't have to come to shelter. It's usually those cases where they've got a temporary place they can stay safe. And then that gives us enough time for them to help them find the right housing they need.
And then to add on to that, something I was just going to say is about someone who might not be experiencing poverty, but they're in a very high lethality situation where they need to escape immediately and remain confidential. That's a really important specialized piece of what our shelter offers, which is different from other shelters in the community because our shelter is completely confidential. We don't release the location of our shelters. We typically do not have any volunteer opportunities where individuals are interacting with clients. We don't release any photographs or information or anything with our clients. Even as far as our data collection, how we are HUD funded, and typically all of the shelters have their data information all together. Ours is completely separate from everybody else's. So survivors' information can't be accessed in that way. So just the confidential piece is a very specialized piece of our shelters that we offer.
And VAWA, you might have heard of that, Victims Violence Against Women Act. There's funding that comes from the federal level to domestic violence shelters, and those are all requirements of that funding, is all that kind of separate database and the confidentiality and all of those pieces. So there's extra protections that domestic violence programs who are funded for domestic violence specifically have for their clients that others would not necessarily have.
Dick, do you have any questions?
No, I guess, is there a certain length of time that they're allowed to stay with you, or is it unending until you feel they're ready to move on?
So do you want to answer, Debbie?
Yeah, so emergency shelter by its definition from HUD is like 30 days, but it's a range depending on what that individual needs. Some individuals can come in, be there for a couple weeks, and we are able to put the pieces together with them and they're ready to move on. And that's the ideal, is that when they are ready, we have helped them take those steps to get there. They can't indefinitely stay in shelter. It's not, but sometimes we have people who are there a little longer, and it's because they have more barriers. So I can give you an example of somebody, let's say we have an immigrant family, and we've had these, with 7 children, mom doesn't speak English. They don't have all of the paperwork that they need to be able to get a job right now because they've fled a domestic violence situation. Their abuser may be holding on to all of their legal documents. So it takes a lot more to work through those cases. We have to work with legal aid to help take care of the legal side of it. We have to have translators and interpreters for them. And we have to find housing that, will contain the whole family, that's safe. So those times you're going to see people staying in a little bit longer than what's typical.
Okay, Frank, do you have any questions? I guess not.
So I don't have any questions.
Do y'all have any questions for us? We just like to be, up to date on what's going on.
Oh, yeah. And we like you to be too. Yeah, we want people to understand kind of what the needs are in the community. I don't think I have any questions. I don't know. Sarah, Tracy?
No, I don't think so. I was just going to ask if there's anything else that you needed from us to review outside of the conversation.
No, I think we're good. Our board meets next Wednesday, July 28th. And as you know, we like to get back to everybody within a week of the meeting. So first week in August, if not earlier, you'd be hearing back from us.
Okay.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions after this or leading up to the meeting, if you're reviewing the application or watch back over the recording or anything, please feel free to email me and I can get you anything you need before the board meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
So much.
Bye-bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.